Hiya, I'm Barry Knight, and I'm going to be moderating this session, whether you like it or not. It's really nice to see this issue come out, because I pitched this idea of doing philanthropy and peacebuilding to Charles Caden, the editor of Alliance, last May, because it was born out of sort of 12 years of frustration working with a group called Foundations for Peace, which are philanthropies, largely community philanthropies, working at local level in recovering war zones. And how we held a meeting in Brussels, thinking that philanthropists would like to come and sort of meet and learn about what we were doing. And we found ourselves talking to ourselves. And the area of peace building is largely invisible to philanthropy. And Foundation Centre is now called Candid. I can't quite get my head around that yet. It actually showed that something like less than 1% of money, philanthropic dollars across the world, actually goes to peace building. So it's a real issue here. And so Charles kind of responded to this idea with glee, and went forward. And I said, I thought it would be good to have 3 guest editors who were actually part of the field. I'm not really part of the field, I support the field, but I'm not part of it. So we have the 3 really smart young women who have guest edited this issue. One is Lauren Bradford from Candid, another is Hope Lyons from Rockefeller Brothers Fund in New York that actually has a peace building portfolio. And the third is Rasha Sansur, who works for the Dahlia Foundation in Palestine. And we were wanting to get Rasha here today. In fact, we booked flights, we booked hotels. At the last minute, we didn't get a visa for her, which is a kind of signal of what it's like if you live in Palestine and in a war zone and what happens to people. She's on the Skype here and listening to every word I say, which is terrifying. But I'm going to try and say a little bit about what she would have said about the issue. But first I want to introduce our 2 speakers. These are really remarkable, seasoned professionals in peace building and have both devoted their careers to it. And what's really interesting, as I've read their CVs, not only have they been philanthropoids, i.e. being professionals giving money away, but they've both been peace volunteers. And I think that kind of shows a kind of commitment to the field, and it gives a kind of an integrity of the understanding of the field. So, just wanting to say why we did this issue, and Rasha set out there were 5 key goals for this issue, and you can judge them. One was to illuminate the field of peace-building philanthropy with examples of practice. The second was to bring some coherence to the diversity of funders, methods and approaches. Third was to critique the peace industrial complex, because so much in peace building happens in very rarefied, elitist circumstances. Explore the merit and value of community-based rather than state-based approaches to philanthropy, and explore the merit of inform philanthropists and philanthropy practitioners about who they can partner with. And you can judge yourselves. Just a side note, there are evaluation forms on your desk. They are required. You will not get out of the room without actually filling them in, giving them to Amy or Zibran. And also, if you're not a subscriber to Alliance, shame on you, you can get a 20% discount today if you sign up. Okay. I think one of the things that I really want to stress with Rasha's contribution before I hand over to the 2 panelists is actually she stresses the importance of social justice. There can be no peace without justice. And she writes about Palestine, saying the word peace is problematic because Palestinians see it as actually a part of the colonial project. And so that in a sense we are never neutral when we are working on peace, and we have to be value driven. One one of the things I wanted to do as part of this issue, which I've done, is to survey the field, and I got 823 responses. Again, I'm not going to run through it all, but the issue gives a preliminary article. I'm going to write a much more detailed report on this, but it shows that actually peacebuilding is a low priority, but increasingly social justice isn't. Social justice is part of the kind of framing of philanthropy in a way that it simply wasn't 15 years ago. So now we need to begin and I think close the loop between social justice funding and peacebuilding funding, because they are part of the same family. And my preliminary investigations of the statistical relationships between them show that there is a link, but it's not always there, and we need to kind of think about this. So the framing question I want you to think about when you're listening to Celia and to Stephen is, what is philanthropy's appropriate role in peacebuilding? And what are the roadblocks, and how can we think about actually maybe removing them and getting them into a different space? So I'm going to talk to, I'm going to turn first to Celia, who probably needs no introduction to you, and she's going to be talking about her article, Rethinking Security.
Hello everybody. Thank you very much, Barry. Thank you for the invitation. So my name is Celia McKeon and I'm the coordinator of Rethinking Security, which is a network of peacebuilding and disarmament organisations. And what I wanted to do in the time that we've got this morning is make two key points really. One is to offer some observations about one of the main obstacles that I see to progress on peacebuilding and some experience of trying to address that. And secondly, to offer some reflections from experience as both a peacebuilder and a grantmaker on opportunities for philanthropy to make a greater contribution in this space. In terms of the first point, talking about obstacles, I started out in the peacebuilding field about 20 years ago now, and my first experience was supporting local organisations who were trying to promote peacebuilding responses in conflict-affected societies, and then documenting both those experiences and the experiences of formal peace negotiations. And it quickly became very apparent to me that sustainable peace is only achievable if it's rooted in communities as well as being owned by the political decision makers. And as I then moved into a policy role, my main objective was to try and get the UK government to buy into this idea and to encourage them to increase their support for peacebuilding and peace processes. And my experience there was that we had some degree of success at getting things written down in policy documents, and occasionally we even did some training for the civil servants. But my experience was that even though those words got written on the paper and that there was some buy-in within the departments, when push came to shove, often peacebuilding commitments were trumped by other concerns, whether that was around trade, arms exports, other kinds of geopolitical alliances that were informing these decisions. And the rubric under which those kind of trade-offs were justified and explained was the rubric of national security. And as I moved into a grant-making role, what I then saw was that challenge being experienced by a number of organisations in the sector and a number of campaigns where they would get so far, but actually the dominant narrative and thinking about national security is a real obstacle to progress on some of these issues. And I think what we also saw is not just the narrative, but the policies that flow from this narrative and the practices that work out on the ground are actually some of the main drivers of global insecurity and some of the main causes of harm that we see in communities. So Rethinking Security was established to try and tackle this pretty overwhelming challenge by starting off by trying to influence the narrative about national security and identify some of the flawed assumptions that underpin it. And I just wanted to share with you from the article, so 3 of those assumptions that we tried to identify. The first was that security can be achieved by extending or consolidating political and economic control and power for one group at the expense of another. And I think what we see in an increasingly interdependent world is that that's not actually a viable proposition anymore, never mind an ethical one. I think the second flawed assumption that dominates this narrative about national security is that priority should be accorded to treating some of the symptoms of the problem, so extremism, international terrorism, rather than addressing and tackling head-on the deeper underlying causes. And thirdly, the third flawed proposition is that security can be achieved by extending control over particular territories or communities through military capabilities, superpower alliances and restrictions on civil liberties at home. And I think what we would argue is that as the world gets more insecure, these propositions are increasingly apparent for what they are. They're causing catastrophic harm across the world to people and communities, and they're also failing on their own terms with regard to the trends in global security and UK security. So the second part of our challenge has then been to try and articulate a narrative about how that can be different, and to draw on the experience of the peacebuilding field and the social justice field in terms of what we know about what is needed to build peace and security. And working along those lines, we've encouraged people to start with a very simple question about actually, what makes you feel secure or insecure in your day-to-day life? How does that relate to the responsibilities of the state? And from there to identify the kind of principles and values that might be at the core of a different approach, as well as 5 kind of core lines of action. And those lines of action that we've identified are around meeting people's basic daily needs for security and survival, consistent protection and promotion of human rights and the rule of law, a commitment to tackling the systemic causes of insecurity, such as climate breakdown, inequality and social marginalisation, policies that promote inclusion, and a renewed investment in peacebuilding, diplomacy and international cooperation. Now, we don't offer those as a complete answer to some of these very complex problems, but we hope that they're a starting point for a different kind of approach. And having kind of set all that out in terms of where the initiative I'm working for is coming from, I also wanted to connect back to the broader discussion that we're having this morning about what that means for philanthropy. And I think the priorities that we've highlighted also chime with a lot of the themes that are quite strong in the publication and relate to what Barry has been saying about the interlinkage between peacebuilding and wider work for social justice. Peacebuilding and social justice need to be connected to each other. Peacebuilding can never only be about elite negotiations or even cross-community dialogue. It needs to be rooted in the needs of communities and in understanding the drivers of conflict and in addressing the problems of an unequal society. And I think the reverse is also true, which is that social justice must be connected to peacebuilding, particularly in contexts that are affected by violent conflict. Because every action or intervention that you make in a society where there's violent conflict affects the dynamics of power between actors and affects the relationships between communities. And I think this presents both a kind of challenge and an opportunity for philanthropy. I think the challenge is recognising that if you don't get this right, you can really do harm in conflict-affected contexts. And you can also waste your money, because there are countless examples of interventions around the world that get completely trampled on by the realities of violent conflict on the ground. But I think the opportunity is there also for philanthropy to understand how interventions that might be framed in terms of social justice more broadly can contribute to the dynamics of peacebuilding, whether that's because they address the drivers of the conflict, they might be about promoting inclusion, they might be about creating a human rights framework. All of these are important contributions to the wider process of building peace. So I think those kinds of observations are a good starting point in terms of how philanthropy could think about engaging with peacebuilding in a more conscious way, perhaps. But I think there are also other opportunities, and I just wanted to share briefly some reflections from a meeting I was at in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, where we had 50 activists from across the Middle East and North Africa who are working in contexts that are on the receiving end of a lot of external interventions which are being done in the name of peace and security. And so we shared 2 days talking about the challenges of those contexts, but also the priority agendas for the field in terms of trying to make a difference. And there were 4 key elements of an agenda for change that came out from that I just thought I'd share with you. One was about understanding and exploring the political economy of securitisation processes and really getting to grips with the agendas and the interests that underpin the kind of status quo. The second was about challenging and changing mainstream narratives about security in the way that I've been talking about. The third agenda was a very simple and kind of fundamental one, which is about supporting local capacities for conflict prevention and peace building. And fourthly, increasing accountability for and protection of human rights in all securitised responses to violent conflict. So those are just some ideas to share, hopefully to get the discussion going. But I think foundations have an incredibly important opportunity because of their agility, their ability to engage for the long term, and also the possibility of working at the intersection of difficult and complex issues.
Thank
so
you.
I hope you respect that.
Thanks very much, Celia. I want to hold off on the kind of role of philanthropy discussion until we've heard from Stephen. But has anybody got any questions, burning questions they'd like to ask Celia? Questions of fact about what she said? She's perfectly clear. You're allowed to speak. Okay. Thanks. So we'll turn to Stephen, who is a long-time peace campaigner, starting I think in the 1970s in Belfast, and going on from there. So tell it like it is, Stephen.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. I'm coming out of retirement, and
You've never been in it.
feeling. I think we don't have the term emeritus, but I feel emeritus insofar that I retired 7 years ago now from the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and I'm absolutely thrilled that I'm sitting next to the new Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. And for anyone who's been keeping their eyes on the JRCT website, yesterday it was announced that Celia McKeon is going to be the new Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, which is brilliant. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen Celia's TEDx talk from Exeter. It's really worth looking at. And what it says on Google as you introduce Celia is a peacemaker, a peace builder. And I think that's absolutely true. And in a way that maybe I don't describe myself in that way. But I am going to be talking really from my experience of working for the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust over 26 years on a variety of issues. And the mission of the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust is to seek to transform the world by supporting people who address the root causes of conflict and injustice. So, with a mission statement like that, you won't be surprised that the issue of conflict prevention, peace building, has always been an important part. And just in terms of talking about Raza, I'm so sorry Raza's not here, because I thought that the 2 articles that came from the Palestinian situation actually questioning about what do we mean by peace and peace building were really very, very important. And I think talking about conflict resolution or conflict solving, addressing the root causes of conflict and injustice is so important in this conversation. I've also worked a little bit in the Middle East, and if you are really interested in peace in the Middle East, it's a challenge. And I was toying with this phrase, balanced partiality. You can't be impartial to injustice. That is just impossible. You've got to address injustice. But in some senses, if you are trying to peace build, you've got to think about the issue of conflict resolution and how you can get dialogue between different sides. So the concept of balanced partiality was something which I thought, helped in some way in that case. But I think it's so important that we recognise that in some situations, the whole concept of peace building is a real challenge. The second point I just wanted to mention was something which I think Celia's referred to. The Berghoff Foundation, quite a few years ago, and Celia might know whether they've revised this, but they did a kind of review of what was happening in the peace building world. And I was amazed there because 80% of money that was going into peace building around the world was actually coming from European governments. And in fact, our own government in the UK was the greatest contributor, which was, I thought, amazing. $419 million was being committed to peace building. That was between the period of 2007 and 2014. But as Celia, I think, suggested, so much of that money was going to states. And one of the issues, of course, it goes to, is to restore the state's monopoly of the use of force, strengthening law and justice mechanisms, and the implementation of liberal rights and freedoms. So really, so much of that is going into actually state building in a way. Whereas the role of philanthropy, it seems to me, is always about civil society. And I think we need to think about what the role of civil society is, of philanthropy is, because there's no point in philanthropy trying to do things that others are engaged in. We have to think about what is our particular role. And the Berghoff Foundation report talked about support especially for the process issues, and particularly talking about strengthening of civil society. And it seems to me that that's important because it's a real problem. I found it a real problem because we always had this program around peace and disarmament, talking about nuclear disarmament, conventional disarmament, but also trying to talk about how we can promote ideas for peace. But all of the good organisations that came to us, they all had very big budgets, which was kind of quite a problem for us as a smaller foundation, because they were all actually tapping into some of the government funding. And yet that restricted them in some ways to not being able to do some of the things that they want to do. So I think that's quite important to really think about that and to think about where philanthropy sits there. What I really wanted to talk then a bit more about was the two areas of work which JRCT was engaged in, which was actually about peace building, when we actually engaged in areas that were in conflict. And one of those was South Africa, and one of them was Northern Ireland. And I suppose there was a particular reason why we engaged in both of those conflicts. On the South Africa side, it was because the old Rowntree company, out of which we got our dividends every year, had a South African factory. And the factory was making quite a lot of profit. But we as a foundation, and this was an interesting story as well, because we were the second biggest after the Joseph Rowntree Foundation shareholder in the Rowntree business, we were not convinced that the Rowntree factory in South Africa was playing a progressive role in thinking about the change that we were all wanting to see there. And so the trustees of the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust made a commitment that they would put all of the resources and more that came from that into peace building in South Africa. And for 50 years that Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust operated a program of peace building in South Africa. Northern Ireland was because we felt, look, here we are talking about wanting to be peace builders, and yet in our own country, I mean, that might be a contentious statement, but within the United Kingdom there was a serious conflict going on. And so from the 1970s, right up to now, we've always had a programme of work. The Rowntree Charitable Trust has always had a programme of work in Northern Ireland, and I'm delighted that out of the most recent strategic review, the decision's been taken to follow on with that programme. And I think that's one of the things that I want to come on to. I want to really draw 3 reflections from those programmes around peace building. One is, I think you really need to know the conflict. That's the first thing. And, you know, I think Celia's mentioned it. It is possible that you can do more harm than good. So you either have to have a good understanding of the conflict yourself, or you have to work with others who do. And I think the Foundations for Peace that Barry's mentioned is an incredible network of community foundations who are engaged in different conflicts around the world. It would be wonderful if more philanthropic money could go into those kind of institutions. And also organisations like Peace Direct have got mechanisms whereby they can get money to people on the ground. But knowing the conflict, I think if you really want to engage as a foundation, is really important. You've got to have some kind of analysis of the conflict and be aware of what you're doing. The second, which kind of links to that and links to this question of how long JRCT committed to its funds to these conflicts, is about longevity. And I think, you know, we would have argued that you need to have a bottom-up approach. So the foundation of JRCT's work in Northern Ireland was always its community development aspect. It was about empowering local communities to think about what their problems were and to how they might address them. And so for many, many years, we were sort of funding a community development approach. And the interesting thing is that out of that you build, as a foundation, you build social capital. And so I think I would argue that for the first 20 years that we were involved in Northern Ireland, we had an approach and understanding of what we were trying to achieve. But in many ways we were funding what we might call single identity work, where we were funding one community or the other to build an understanding. And I always think in terms of bonding and bridging capital. You can't start bridging unless you've got strong piers and foundations on either side. You know, you need to do that. So you have to sort of build that approach. But the interesting thing is with longevity comes opportunities, because people get to know you as a foundation, and then they come to you and they start to ask you to engage with interesting things. So towards the end of the kind of period of conflict, and I'm not saying that we've got peace yet in Northern Ireland, but towards the end of that conflict, we were offered opportunities to engage in all sorts of different work. So working on policing. You know, imagine what it must be like if you've had people who have been shooting at and fighting the police service. And then all of a sudden, in a post-conflict situation, the representatives of that side need to be involved in the peace board. You know, how do you work on that? And that was one of the issues that an opportunity came up for the Rowntree Charitable Trust to work on. Or some of the real problems in terms of the peace process negotiations. So, you know, I see John's here from who was with Atlantic Philanthropies at the time, and we were able to work with Atlantic Philanthropies on trying to organise a mediation process around the Drum Cree parades, which at one point were almost undermining the whole of the peace process. And we never solved that problem, but I think the process that we involved in did take the sting out of that conflict. And then the whole question of prisoners, of course. You know, how do you reintegrate prisoners in a situation of conflict once the conflict's over? So that's the second third. And the third point links to all of that, and that is about philanthropy, foundations being able to be adventurous. You know, I think sometimes we're very cautious in foundations, but we have the ability to be adventurous and to do things that others can't. So some of those things that I've just mentioned, no one else could have done. It couldn't have been done by the state, the business community wouldn't have been able to do it, So the foundations are so well placed to be able to take risks for peace, which is what Avila Kilmurray of the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland always talked about. How do you take risks for peace? And that, to me, is really important for the foundation world. And the final thing, that, just to mention out of this story, is that we then took a risk to break our own rules. Insofar that the organisation ETA, who were the Basque terrorist organisation, came to the IRA and said, how do you start a peace process? And the IRA said, well, one of the things you could do is talk to this guy, who was Brian Curran, who was a South African human rights lawyer, who had been working with JRCT and Atlantic Support in Northern Ireland on the Rowntree Parade and also on the policing issue. And we said to ourselves, he came to us and said, look, I've been asked if I might engage with the peace process in the Basque Country. And we said, well, look, this is outside of our criteria. You know, we don't engage in conflict situations unless we know the conflict, you know, and we feel that we've got something to engage with. And he said, well, look, unless I've got some resources, I can't do this. And so in the end, we did. And we made 5 grants to Brian Curran. And he managed to persuade, he worked in the Basque Country, and he managed to persuade the organisations associated with ETA that they had to have a political arm that was able to negotiate with the state. And the amazing thing was that after 7 years of supporting this one individual, that did eventually happen. Now there were other factors and other people were engaged as well. But it was a remarkable story for us about how taking a risk to create peace actually did work. So I'd love to encourage all the foundations here to really think creatively about how to do that. And it's great that Charles has come in, because I did want to mention, in terms of thinking about this issue, don't just read the papers on the peace building, but read the editorial. Because Charles was then talking about the risks that he took in terms of actually engaging with people associated with Hamas in Gaza when he was working for the Pears Foundation here in the UK. And for me, that's an example of courage and a willingness to take risks that I think foundations are so well placed to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask, direct any questions to Stephen before we get into the general discussion. Would you say who you are?
I'm James L. Reid. I was interested that you talked about, you used this phrase, balanced partiality. I understand how to be partial, I'm not sure I understand how to be balanced.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think I said I was toying with that idea.
Right.
I was toying with that idea. If you are interested, for instance, you know, and this did relate to work that I was engaged in the Middle East. If you were really interested in thinking about the Palestinian situation in Israel, what is your role as peacemaking? You can't take an impartial view because there's such an element of injustice, and yet neither can you ignore the perpetrator or whatever, whoever you say, and I'd say the same in any conflict, you know. And so you have to have some sense of engagement with both sides. You know, you need to do that because otherwise, you know, you're not building the peace. And I think that's one of the dangers that you can be, is that you can actually reinforce. It's possible for you to reinforce the kind of insularity of some of the partners if you're not very careful. So that idea of balanced partiality was to say, look, we're not impartial here, you know, because injustice is involved, you know. We have to actually name the injustice, you know, but we are also interested in how you actually try and find some kind of communication.
I think that's a really important question. and a good answer, Stephen. I'd just like to quote from Rasha Sansur from Palestine, in what she would have said had she been here. I highlight the meaning of peace for Palestinians. Peace talks is a charade used as a tool to continue the colonial project in Palestine. As we speak, somewhere in Palestine, a settler is committing acts of violence against Palestinians, either burning their olive trees or kicking them out of their house. With the peace talks also arrived in...
Just my question, I'm new to the space, I don't know very much about it, so thank you very much for your comments. Thinking about engaging more foundations and getting more funding for these things. I mean, tapping into everybody's talking about the SDGs and whether foundations can come together and discuss which SDGs are not getting met, which ones are going to get left behind. And so we're definitely in Ariadne and the groups coming together, whether there can be a discourse and narrative about, well, there's 17 of them, which ones are we not going to meet, which ones are getting completely forgotten, whether maybe that's the framework. Of course, foundations have their rules, what they can and they can't do, and the boards have to agree. But perhaps that would present an opportunity, because the foundations, I'm sure, will come together to discuss the SDGs that they are.
SDG 16 is very relevant in this particular case. Do you want to comment? Neither of you mentioned SDGs.
Well, maybe just briefly, I do think it could be a useful framework for looking at the interrelationship between all of these different issues. So yeah, I think there's definitely potential there. Can I just, Barry?
Yeah, go. Yeah.
So on the question of how do we build the kind of peace and security foundation sector, so it would be wonderful if we could persuade more philanthropists to have an explicit peace and security programme or lens. But at the same time, what would also be wonderful is if those foundations who are working on other social justice issues would apply a peace-building lens within their existing programming. So, for example, foundations who are working on women's rights, peace agreements are 35% more likely to last 15 years if there are women involved in the peace process, and yet there's still only 5% of women who are negotiators. So for foundations involved in women's rights philanthropy, there's a whole field of work there that still needs a lot more support. Similarly, with foundations working with young people, there's all kinds of evidence being done through the UN's recent work on youth peace and security, which shows the importance of the role of young people in addressing these issues and the various different ways in which that can be facilitated. So I think the challenge for us is to have more of these conversations and explore where the possibilities really are, because we've all got our very legitimate priorities in different areas of the foundation world, and there's work for everyone across such a broad spectrum of issues. But I think the exciting opportunity is to explore those interconnections and be open to doing our programming in a way that breaks out of the silos that we often put ourselves in.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think I'd like to make a comment. It's Joy from Light for the World, but Light for the World is not at all involved in peacebuilding or in the Middle East. And I'm coming from the angle of being Palestinian, Lebanese, or the Syrian in me, so I'm coming from all sides. And I think there is, it's fantastic to hear people from Europe discussing this issue. There is a lot. I see also. I've got friends, working for UNRWA, working for, I hear foundations. I think the problem is, and I could go on for hours and hours, but we have to work on ourselves. I went to a facilitation class, and I said to them, "What was your biggest challenge?" Was like we had to work on, facilitating a conversation between Israelis and Palestinians, And as you said, it is about fear, it is about emotions. How do you mitigate this? And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring down the emotions, the fear of not being able to dialogue. And it's all mixed in with so many different other issues. The religion coming in, the gender issues. So you cannot separate it from, history and this, but it has to go through so many other things, other disciplines. So I just wanted to bring this out. So yes, conversation is great, but it has to also go from the ground, as you said.
Yes, and I think that's an important perspective. I think when you think about social change, and we often think about we need to change some external agency. We don't often think about the change that I need to make about my myself and how I connect and how I relate. And I think living in this country at the moment where the dialogue seems to be based on a kind of principle of shrill absolutism. I am absolutely right and you're absolutely wrong kind of thing, and nobody's really listening to one another. We need, part of this is the breakdown of kind of trust that is so endemic across the world. And how do philanthropies begin to work on these rather soft issues of power, trust, hope, relationship, the kind of, how it is to be human in the world, rather than thinking about how many wells did we build last year, or how many schools did we build, those kind of tangible things which are easy to count, but ultimately are not what actually really counts in terms of our relationships with each other and on the planet. I think that's a very good point. Yeah.
I'm Julie from Ariadne. One of the things that I've experienced as a grant maker and then now working with a lot of different foundations is the difficulty of keeping decision makers, boards, etc., involved in long-term conflict situations where you see very little change in a short amount of time. So just wondering if you have any advice for how to kind of think about impact and how to think about the incremental change that you're seeing in order to keep the foundations and other decision makers engaged for what is inevitably going to be a long-term process.
That's a good question.
We probably both speak to the same experience.
Go on,
we'll
speak
see
to it
if we're coherent at all. So both of us were involved with the Northern Ireland programme at JRCT, which has been doing this funding for 40 years now. And I think it wouldn't have been possible without the active participation of the trustees in the grant-making process, which has meant that they are going to Northern Ireland, they're sitting with grant applicants, they're learning about the situation, they're understanding the challenges of what they're doing, and also some of the amazing work that they managed to pull off. And I think, for me, it's as simple as that, as the kind of direct, tangible engagement and relationship building and understanding of the issues that has built the commitment and the passion for the work over time. And I appreciate it's a lot easier to do that if you've got trustees, sitting in throughout England and Scotland and Wales going to Northern Ireland than if you're going to, other parts of the world. But I think there's probably no substitute for that real engagement with the people and the issues.
I think there is a clear sense that among the peace-building community that time is a critical resource, and that you can't do things quickly. There's an adage, which I don't know how true it is, that often it takes people to get as long out as a conflict as it took them to get into conflict in the first place. So you're often talking about intergenerational stuff. Has anybody got any experience of the kind of long-term, short-term kind of issue? Did Julie's question resonate with anybody else? Yeah.
I'm speaking.
And you are?
So Sarah Bradford from.
Could you stand up, because I'm just slightly concerned about the acoustics in the room or whether.
Yeah, no, speaking not from a grant-making perspective, but from an organisation working in Peacebuilding,
Yeah.
so from Conservation Resources. This is one of the questions I was going to ask actually, because the long-term nature is absolutely vital, and we work in a global context for the long term, working directly with local partners. And I think, for example, one recent example is where we had flexible funding that enabled us to support a process between the ONLF in Ethiopia and the Ethiopian government, which has just resulted in a peace deal. And that wouldn't have been possible had we not had that flexible funding through times when we couldn't have funded it any other way. And I think that enabled us to support this process over 6 years period. And it just shows that, we need people to take those risks to people the same.
Committing for the long haul. The problem is there's not a lot of press releases in that, is there? You wanted to say something?
Yeah, sure.
Would you stand up?
Hi, I'm Richard Reeve from Oxford Research Group. We have a lot of experience working for the long term in Palestine and Israel with our methodology, which we call strategic peace building, which is about developing the capacity within groups to strategize for what they want from the peace process, regardless of whether they're in a dialogue with the other side. Unfortunately, we've had good support on that from statutory donors, like the Norwegian government in particular, but also others. What's more difficult for us is sustaining the conversation about what might not happen. I think there's a particular challenge in the sector we work in terms of defining beneficiaries. Because a lot of what we work in, like what you work in, Dylan, and the Peacebuilding sector, conservation resources, you've got a conflict. It's quite obvious. People are at each other's throats, they've been killing each other. They need to do something about it to get them talking to each other to make a peace process work, right? Donors will give money to that. There's a clear beneficiary. Something has gone terribly wrong, they need to put it right. But that's a very ineffective use of money to resolve conflict. So the challenge of conflict prevention, of course, is peace building for something that might not go terribly wrong, to making that not happen. But also, in terms of a lot of what we do is around kind of nuclear policy, that narrative aspect of how does the UK not be a problematic actor? So we've done a lot of strategizing in the last year or two in particular, and we've come up against that beneficiary angle. Who benefits from the war? You say, well, humanity, the world benefits from our work. Well, that's not something that donors are going to fund. They got specific boxes to tick. And the world is not that box.
Yeah.
So I wonder, thoughts around how one can beneficiarise global common goods.
Yeah, it's putting unboxables into boxes. Anybody got any thoughts about that? Do you want to respond to that, Stephen?
Well, only insofar that, I suppose I would have quite a critical view of how philanthropy tends to operate, because it's moved, it seems to me, over the last 20, 30 years into a far more, we want to know what the outcome is going to be, and we're going to, we need to know who the beneficiaries are. I mean, that term in itself is an interesting one, because it seems to me it's something that's come into our discourse over the last 20, 30 years. And the thing about philanthropy for me is that it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to. If it wants to, it can, but it doesn't have to have a discourse at that level. It can, because of the freedom that it's got, really, take a different line if it wanted to. And I always used to have lots of interesting conversations with colleagues about the issue of evaluation. Well, evaluation for the kind of work that JRCT was involved in, which was about trying to change hearts and minds and to think about issues of injustice and conflict prevention, very, very difficult to actually work out things. And if you wanted to evaluate a programme, think about the work in Northern Ireland. When do you evaluate? Do you evaluate after 5 years and say, oh, well, we haven't got very far, or after 10 years or after 20 years, or, how do you build into that sort of process of thinking about how effective you're being? Those kind of longer term aims. And I haven't got the answers to that, apart from saying, why do we do it? Why do we, as independent funders who have the freedom to take risks and to think about the longer term and not to have to think about, performance indicators, why do we do it? And one of the lovely things that I felt, which we did at the Rowntree Charitable Trust when we were celebrating our centenary in 2004, and we wanted to look for visionaries. And we said, if you can persuade us, we will give you 5 years to pursue your vision. No performance indicators. No performance indicators. A meeting every year to see how you're getting on, but no performance indicators. And I think that liberation that you can do, liberation, talking the language of liberation, people to be liberated to do the work that they're doing, rather than having to worry about indicators. That is how I would like to think philanthropy operates. Now, it doesn't answer your problem because you're having to actually seek money from foundations that don't tend to work in that way. But I would love the foundation world to give some more thought to all of this, you know.
And I think there's some responsibility on us who want to see that kind of world, to build the narrative where we can actually be convincing. Because the problem is that the measurable, tangible outputs is a very attractive idea because you can put it in a spreadsheet and you can actually put a line chart and see, you know, what are the developments. And you know, so much of the trustee groups are often coming from business where that sort of methodology is employed. And having run a charitable trust myself, you know, you're always sort of fighting the you know, the simplistic kind of measurement tool. I think it's a really critical, and I think it relates to your point about how do we actually develop that narrative, because I think we need that narrative. And certainly in you know, I'm involved with Shift the Power. That's something we're actually working on to see how can we actually measure change, not in necessarily in a quantitative way, but in a qualitative way. And I think that is a critical point. Charles, you've been wanting to come in for some time, the editor of Alliance.
Yeah, Charles from Alliance, and thank you, Aaron, for having an inspiration for this issue. I mean, it was a year in planning. Just a couple of brief observations in relation to duties to think about impact. The first is that perhaps achievement is always provisional. So in the issue is documents the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which perhaps is the equivalent of JRCT in the UK and the work they've done on Peacebuilding. They played an instrumental role, particularly the President, on the Iran deal, which could be seen as a great achievement, helping to foster that deal. But, of course, the gains may be undone in the current situation. Does that mean that the investment they made and the advance they made wasn't important? But it does maybe point to the provisional nature of the gains that were made. And just for some more specific points of impact from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund that are involved in guest editing this issue, on page 57 there is an article which points to very much the points that Stephen Pittam is making about the ecosystem of players and the need to think in a more lateral and less linear way about the gains that we made. Just a brief reflection, seeing as it was pointed to about my time as where we were involved in Israel-Palestine conflict work. In 2006, Hamas were elected in the elections in Gaza when it came to power, and there was a question about political courage, which maybe philanthropy could help to engender around the ability to actually engage with the regime there, which wasn't taken by the politicians at the time. So instead of an engagement with the political wing of Hamas, there was a shift towards isolation. And it does mean, I think, foundations are investing in that way, maybe trying to broker those conversations must accept to be reconciled to failure, because they, you know, ultimately, you know, the situation in Gaza is nothing short of a failure, and philanthropy's efforts have, towards the extent they exist in the first place, have failed, in spite of efforts to maybe build and foster those dialogues. So I think, again, that's a comment on the challenging nature of this effort. That foundation's lack of accountability allows it to kind of evolve itself in. Maybe the pressures are going to be greater now in terms of being able to do this kind of work. And I think one final point is there are questions about legitimacy of foundations and private actors working in conflict zones and the extent to which we want non-state actors being involved in that work with that balanced partiality. Not everyone might be balanced, and one person's view about what is partial will not be another, particularly in, you know, very intractable conflicts like Israel and Palestine. So I think the issues are fraught with difficulty. That's not to say they shouldn't be navigated, but maybe that's a comment on some of the challenges that foundations face when they're thinking about those two interviews.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks. I think that's really useful about, you know, drawing on the RBF experience of evaluation, because they actually do take it seriously and have got some good methods. We could maybe think about that. Yeah.
Jennifer, and I'll read again. Do you think the effective altruism movement is, in view of what you've said earlier, do you think that's detrimental to getting funding for peace building and stuff, because it's, the effective altruism movement is very much geared to being able to measure stuff?
I don't know much about it. I know a little bit about it. maybe could you explain a little
Could you
bit
tell
more
us
what it is?
what you think?
Well-
They don't know.
Okay, so effective altruism is very much looking at what's the most good you can do with your money. All right, so you've got $1.
Yeah.
Should you give it to a local cat's home, or should you give it to Oxfam, or should you give it to one of the charities represented here? So it's looking at what will do the most good. Peter Singer, who's a philosopher, has written quite a few books about it, The Life You Could Save. His most recent book, I think, is called something like The Most Good You Can Do. So it's very much looking at measuring, of course it's interested in measuring outcomes. And so, one of the things I think people have been saying is it's very difficult to measure outcomes in terms of peace building. When do you measure outcomes? When do you say, that Northern Ireland, we can now measure the outcomes? And so on. There's all sorts of issues around this. So, but the effective altruism movement, which started in the US and is now, I think, coming here, I mean, the people who get into that make very large, are often people who are making very, very large donations.
Yes.
But I don't know that the sort of work here can be represented to them in a way that would actually galvanise people who follow that sort of idea to do things.
Okay, that's something we can look at. I just wanted to sort of give you some impressions, because we're coming towards, I will give you two guys a chance to sort of come back, and also sort of range of a few questions before we sort of close. But one of the things that's really struck me from the discussion so far is that I think philanthropy does have a role, and it's actually at the moment confused about that role, because there are all sorts of barriers in the way of how do you get in. But it seems to me that there's one kind of critical finding, and it's clear in my survey, that peace is out in the cold, whereas people are actually beginning to see the links between various other things, like the environment, like the economy, like well-being, those kinds of things. Philanthropies are coming to realise that actually there's an interconnection between poverty and the environment, for example, and you can't actually do one thing without the other. And philanthropy has the luxury of looking across a wide range of areas. It doesn't have to restrict itself to a narrow silo-based kind of program. And it's a real puzzle to me why peace is left out, and it definitely is left out. So one of the things I think we need to think as a community, and this relates to all of us, wherever we are in the field, whether it's JRCT or whether it's kind of thinking support organisations like Ariadne, is how can we begin to join up these different strands and put peace into the equation? And what's the narrative that we need to have that will actually enable that to happen? I've been working, Rethinking Poverty. I wrote a book a year or so back. And part of that, I don't think we can think about poverty without thinking about the underlying structural factors in society. And I don't think starting with poverty is the right place. I think we need to start with what is a good and healthy society. Because if you have a good and healthy society, you won't have any poverty in it. You won't have violent conflict in it. You won't have global warming in it. So we begin to reframe the narrative, which is why I think the reframing security piece is so kind of critical, because we're all involved in security. And the word peace, I remember that Stephen Pittam, when I went to talk to your trustees in 2004, I've got a terribly good memory, he said to me, peace is a dirty word. And it's still quite a dirty word in philanthropy. And how do we actually rehabilitate that? Because something like 13.8% of the wealth in the world is wasted because of war. There's an economic factor to this. So even if you don't care about, well-being of people, there's actually a huge cost going on that even economists could kind of recognise. So I think in a way we need, as a philanthropic community, to begin to really wrestle with these things. Because philanthropy does need a new story. It is under threat, and in some senses quite rightly so. You know, there are some questions to be asked, and I think Charles's question about legitimacy is a really important one. What right does it give to private wealthy people have to interfere in public matters? You know, that's a quite issue. And I remember years ago, Alliance running something on the Gates Foundation where the front cover was a gorilla, and how, you know, Gates actually can influence what happens more than states can. Is that legitimate? There are these kinds of questions we really need to kind of have a firm and a rethink about. So I think that's really important. Does anybody want to contribute any more thoughts before I turn to Celia and Stephen for a final summing up? Yeah.
I'm Rick Holland, Compassion in World Farming, so not directly in the peacebuilding realm. But it strikes me a little bit when you're talking about the risk